The diplomatic salon in Washington was staged like a photograph: white orchids in glass, discreet flags in the corners, a soft wash of light that made everything look reasonable. Cameras waited in the outer corridor. Inside, aides rehearsed smiles. Jill Biden entered first, practiced grace in motion, the kind of warmth that reassures and instructs at the same time. Ibrahim Traoré followed with a smaller entourage, shoulders square, gaze steady, carrying the stillness of someone who measures rooms, not applause. Pleasantries moved like coasters, placed, then ignored. A staffer mentioned shared values, another partnership opportunities, but the current in the room was older than the words. When the conversation finally cleared its throat, Jill's tone stayed gentle, but the meaning had angles. "We open doors for you," she said, hands folded, eyes kind. "That's what friendship looks like. Access. Opportunity. A path." Traoré didn't rush. He let the sentence complete its echo. "We've built our own," he answered, voice level as a ruler on a plan table. The quiet that followed had texture. One aide stopped typing. Another looked down as if the carpet might give instructions. Jill's smile thinned half a degree. "Every nation needs allies," she said. "Some doors are locked for a reason. We can help navigate the complexities." "Complexities," Traoré repeated, tasting the word without swallowing it. "You mean the habit of deciding who passes, and at what price?" A clock ticked loud enough to be noticed. Beyond the frosted glass, a boom mic shifted, hunting sound. Inside, the first hairline in the script had appeared. Jill leaned forward, soft power sharpened to a point. "Captain, the world rewards those who collaborate. It punishes those who isolate." Traoré's gaze didn't move. Punishment is an interesting word to use in a friendship. For a heartbeat, the orchids seemed to hold their breath. In the far corner, an aide scribbled and underlined, "Doors is not equal to permission." The room had not risen in volume, but the floor felt closer, as though the weight of what had been said pressed it upward. This was supposed to be choreography. It was becoming a choice. Outside, the corridor lights flickered as cameras came alive. Inside, the line had been drawn, between a promise that sounded like guidance and a reply that sounded like a foundation. The meeting moved into the adjoining conference room, where sunlight fell in long, disciplined lines through the blinds. Coffee was poured, but neither Jill Biden nor Ibrahim Traoré reached for it. The table between them looked less like a space for conversation and more like a border. Jill began outlining what she called practical frameworks, trade corridors, joint infrastructure programs, and trusted partnerships with Western financial institutions. Her voice stayed calm, but there was a subtle cadence meant to lead the listener toward agreement. "With our networks, President Traoré, we can accelerate your projects by years. You won't need to push against every locked door, we can simply open them." Traoré's hands stayed clasped, not defensive, but deliberate. "When you open a door for someone, do you expect them to remember it was yours?" His tone wasn't sharp, but it carried a quiet weight that pushed back against the air. Jill hesitated just long enough for it to register. "Acknowledgement is part of respect," she replied. "Respect," Traoré said slowly, "is recognizing that some people have learned to build without asking for keys." The aides shifted in their seats, glancing between the two leaders as if the conversation might tip from diplomacy into something irreversible. Jill leaned back slightly, recalibrating. "President Traoré, in this world, no nation thrives alone. Partnerships aren't a weakness, they're survival." He met her gaze directly. "Then maybe survival is not my only measure of success." There was no raised voice, no dramatic gesture, only a stillness so dense it silenced even the clicking of pens. This was the pivot, one leader offering a ladder, the other questioning the height it led to. Outside the window, traffic moved on Constitution Avenue, oblivious to the subtle but historic negotiation unfolding inside. The cameras were still waiting in the hallway, ready to capture smiles and handshakes. What they wouldn't see was the undercurrent, the clash between a worldview built on access granted and one built on doors made by hand. The dialogue now carried an undercurrent that no press release could smooth over. Jill adjusted a folder in front of her, as if rearranging the papers might reorder the conversation. "President Traoré," she said carefully, "the world notices who you stand with. Aligning with us signals stability and trust to investors." Traoré's eyes didn't waver. "And who do you stand with when stability serves only those already seated at the table?" His words landed without force in volume, but with force in meaning. Jill leaned forward slightly, voice lowering as though to suggest candor. "Sometimes the cost of independence is isolation. You can have influence or you can have walls, not both." The corner of Traoré's mouth shifted into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Walls keep some things out. They also keep some things in. We build them when needed. We open them when it's right." Her fingers tapped the folder, once, twice. "That's a dangerous way to think in a global economy." "That," he replied, "is the only way to think if you want to remain whole." The room felt smaller, as if the air had thickened. An aide coughed quietly, more out of nervousness than need. The sunlight through the blinds now cut sharper lines across the table, slicing the space between them into alternating stripes of light and shadow. Jill tried again, softening her voice. "This isn't about taking control. It's about sharing it." "Sharing," Traoré said, "only works when both sides believe they are equals. Do you?" The pause that followed was not silence, it was the sound of every person in the room choosing not to move. The answer, whatever it was, did not come. Instead, Jill closed the folder with deliberate care, the faint thud carrying more weight than any applause. In that moment, both leaders knew they would walk out to the cameras and speak of cooperation. But the real story, the story of who built which doors and who held which keys, would stay in this room, embedded in the grain of the table and the stripes of shadow. By the fourth round of their exchange, the formalities were starting to fray. The language was still diplomatic, but the pauses between sentences grew heavier, weighted with what each side understood but didn't want to say aloud. Jill drew on a more personal tone now. "President Traoré, I've met many leaders who start with ideals like yours. They speak of building their own systems, but eventually, they come to us. Not because they want to, because the world demands it." Traoré's expression stayed still, almost serene. "If the world demands it, perhaps it's time to ask whose world it is." Her brow tightened ever so slightly. "It's a shared world. You can't change that." He leaned forward, resting his elbows lightly on the table. "Shared power is not the same as shared ownership. You've had the keys for a long time, Jill. We've had to make our own doors, our own locks, and sometimes even our own walls." An advisor across the table scribbled notes furiously, as if these words might someday serve as ammunition in a future negotiation. Jill's tone sharpened, though her volume didn't rise. "You risk isolating your people. You risk turning potential allies into wary observers." Traoré replied without hesitation, "Better to be observed standing than to be embraced kneeling." The silence that followed was not accidental, it was the kind that let meaning settle like dust on a polished floor. Through the blinds, the sun had shifted, bathing Jill's side of the table in light while leaving Traoré in shadow. It was an image almost too symbolic, as though the room itself wanted to paint the contrast. Neither leader moved to change it. Somewhere outside, a staffer knocked softly on the door to signal the press was waiting. But inside, time slowed. Jill's hand rested on the folder again, but this time, she didn't open it. She seemed to understand that what was unfolding here couldn't be written into policy, it was a collision of convictions, and neither was yielding ground. The walk to the press room was short, but neither Jill nor Traoré filled it with small talk. Each step echoed down the corridor, accompanied by the quiet shuffle of aides and security. The weight of their private conversation still hung in the air, unspoken but unmistakable. As they approached the double doors, Jill slowed her pace. "When we stand before those cameras," she said quietly, "we'll speak of cooperation, not division. That's the story people expect to hear." Traoré's gaze stayed forward. What people expect and what people need are not always the same. She glanced sideways at him. "Then what do they need?" "They need to see that dignity isn't granted by someone else's approval," he replied, voice steady. "They need to know that a handshake doesn't erase the need for self-respect." The door opened, and a blast of camera flashes lit their faces. For the watching press, it was a picture of diplomacy, two leaders side by side, each wearing the practiced expressions that read as mutual respect. But the contrast was subtle. Jill's smile was calibrated, almost scripted. Traoré's was restrained, an acknowledgement of the moment but not a surrender to it. As they stepped up to the podium, Jill began with the expected script. "Today's meeting reaffirmed the shared values and commitments between our nations." Her voice was even, polished. Behind her words, she was threading a narrative meant for headlines, one that emphasized unity over friction. When it was Traoré's turn, he didn't discard diplomacy, but he didn't dilute his message either. "Partnership," he said, "is strongest when both sides stand on their own feet. We will walk forward together, but we will walk as equals." The room's hum shifted. Reporters exchanged glances, scribbling down the line that would compete for tomorrow's headlines. The flash of cameras intensified, freezing the moment in countless frames, a handshake poised between cordiality and quiet defiance. After the press conference ended, the official smiles dissolved as quickly as they had appeared. Cameras were packed away, microphones unplugged, and the crowd of reporters dispersed into the hallway. Jill turned to Traoré as aides began gathering their notes. "You have a way of delivering your message without raising your voice," she remarked, half in admiration, half in challenge. "It's not volume that carries truth," Traoré answered. "It's consistency. If I change my tone in front of cameras, it means I'm hiding something." Jill tilted her head. "Or it means you're protecting something." He met her gaze evenly. "Sometimes the best way to protect something is to make sure everyone can see it clearly." They moved to a smaller, private lounge where coffee had been set out. The atmosphere here was less rigid, no podiums, no blinding flashes, but the tension between them remained, simmering under the polite exchanges. Jill took a seat and leaned forward. "Look, President Traoré, I respect your independence. But there are practical realities. Influence isn't just about control, it's about who gets to decide the pace of progress. If you insist on doing everything alone, you might move slower than the challenges ahead." Traoré stirred his coffee slowly before replying. "And yet, when others have set the pace for us, they've never led us to our destination. They've led us to theirs." The statement landed heavily. Jill didn't argue immediately. She knew it wasn't just rhetoric. It was history speaking. A moment of quiet settled over the room before she spoke again. "Maybe the difference is this: we think in terms of systems, you think in terms of sovereignty. The question is whether those can coexist." Traoré's answer was immediate. "They can, but only if sovereignty comes first." The room's clock ticked softly, marking the seconds until their aides would return to steer the day's schedule. But in this brief, unguarded exchange, the distance between their worldviews felt both vast and immovable. The afternoon sun streamed through the tall windows of the lounge, casting long lines of light across the carpet. Outside, the muted hum of the capital went on as usual, traffic moving, voices carrying in the distance, but inside, the conversation between Jill and Traoré was drawing sharper edges. Jill placed her coffee cup down gently, her fingers resting on the handle. "President Traoré," she said, her tone softened but deliberate, "you speak of sovereignty like it's a shield. But in a world this connected, isolation can be dangerous." Traoré leaned back slightly, not defensive, but unmoved. "And I say connection can be dangerous when it's a leash." She studied his face, searching for any sign of concession, but found none. "You know," Jill said slowly, "many leaders I've met would gladly take the doors we offer, the alliances, the trade routes, the diplomatic weight. But you seem to prefer building walls instead." He shook his head. "Walls keep danger out. Doors invite it in. The question is, who holds the key?" Jill's lips curved into a faint, knowing smile. "Keys can be shared." "Not when they come with strings," he replied firmly. The air between them seemed to thicken. Neither raised their voice, but the clash in their perspectives filled the space louder than any argument. The aides re-entered, quietly noting the subtle shift in energy, and began discussing the next engagement, a cultural event meant to showcase cooperation between their nations. As they stood to leave, Jill said one last thing, her voice light but her eyes sharp. "One day, President Traoré, you may find that even your strongest walls need a door." Traoré met her gaze with calm certainty. "And when that day comes, it will be a door we built ourselves." The words lingered like an unshakable echo as they walked toward the next room, the sound of their footsteps blending with the distant applause awaiting them. The cultural event was staged in a grand hall adorned with rich fabrics, intricate woodwork, and the sound of traditional instruments weaving through the air. Guests mingled, diplomats exchanged pleasantries, and performers prepared to showcase the heritage of Traoré's homeland. Yet, beneath the surface, the earlier exchange between Jill and Traoré still hummed with unresolved energy. As they toured the exhibits side by side, Jill gestured toward a display of handcrafted doors carved by local artisans. "Beautiful work," she said, tracing the air above the intricate patterns. "Each one unique, and yet, each meant to open." Traoré caught the hint immediately. "Or to stay closed until the right hands arrive," he countered. She smiled thinly, as if conceding a point she didn't truly surrender. "The thing about doors," Jill continued, "is that they can be an invitation, a welcome. They don't have to be a surrender." "And yet," Traoré replied, "too often they've been invitations for others to take what isn't theirs." They paused before a long table where elders shared stories in soft, rhythmic voices. Jill listened politely, but her eyes flicked toward Traoré as if measuring the depth of his convictions. The conversation between them shifted when a young performer approached with a tray of ceremonial tea. Jill accepted graciously. "Perhaps we can find a blend," she suggested, "something that keeps your sovereignty and still opens you to the world." Traoré sipped, considering her words. "A blend is possible," he admitted. "But the recipe must come from our side, or it won't taste like ours at all." The music swelled in the background as they moved on, their dialogue hidden beneath the polite applause of the crowd. Yet, to those who had watched closely, it was clear this was no simple cultural exchange, it was a quiet negotiation of principles, as intricate as the carvings on the doors they had just passed. The evening banquet unfolded in a softer light, the hall now filled with the aroma of spices, the gentle clink of cutlery, and the murmur of conversations in multiple languages. Diplomats from both nations moved about, yet the magnetic pull between Jill and Traoré seemed to draw them back into quiet corners of dialogue. Jill leaned slightly toward him as they stepped away from the main table. "You know," she began, her tone wrapped in charm, "sometimes doors are not built to control, but to protect. They can keep threats out, yes, but they can also shelter those inside." Traoré glanced at her, reading the subtext. "Protection is not what concerns me," he said evenly. "It's who controls the lock." She nodded slowly, as though conceding the validity of his suspicion. "And if the lock was in your hands?" she asked. "Then it would not be your door," he replied without hesitation. For a brief moment, silence fell between them, interrupted only by the distant sound of a drumline announcing the next course of the evening's performances. Jill broke the stillness with a smile. "You are a stubborn man, President Traoré. And you," he countered gently, "are persistent. Which is why we are both still here, talking." They walked toward a balcony overlooking the city, its skyline glistening with the light of progress and history interwoven. Jill gestured to the horizon. The world is too small for closed minds and closed borders. Traoré's gaze remained fixed on the city lights. It is also too small for open invitations to exploitation. The tension between them no longer felt combative, but rather like the slow shaping of two stones against each other, neither breaking, but both altering in subtle ways. The final moments of the evening carried a quiet weight. The performances had ended, the crowd thinned, and the once bustling hall now echoed with the faint sound of staff clearing tables. Jill and Traoré stood again near the carved wooden doors they had discussed earlier, their silent witness to an entire evening of words both spoken and implied. Jill broke the stillness first. "You know, President Traoré," she said softly, "I didn't come here to change your mind. I came to see if our paths could run alongside each other, even if the doors are different." Traoré's eyes studied the craftsmanship of the wood, his fingers brushing the edge of a carved pattern. "Paths can run alongside," he agreed, "but only if both travelers respect the other's road." She smiled faintly. "Respect is earned." He turned toward her, his voice steady. "And so is trust. We have built our own doors, Jill. Not to keep the world out, but to decide for ourselves when and how it comes in." There was no arrogance in his tone, only the calm certainty of someone who had seen his people stand against storms before. Jill exhaled slowly, the tension in her shoulders easing. "Then perhaps," she said, "we can meet on the threshold one day." Traoré nodded. "If that day comes, we will open the door ourselves." They exchanged a brief handshake, neither triumphant nor defeated. It was the kind of handshake that marked a pause in a conversation rather than its end. Outside, the city lights burned brighter against the deep African night, casting long shadows through the ornate doorway. It was not an agreement, nor was it a dismissal, it was the beginning of a new understanding, framed by the kind of distance that demands both patience and resolve. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight was not about winning or losing an argument. It was about standing before one another, unflinching, with our truths laid bare. We spoke of doors, who builds them, who holds the keys, and who decides when they open. And perhaps the greatest truth we uncovered is this: a door's strength is not in its lock, but in the dignity of the people behind it. We, the people of Burkina Faso, have learned to build our own doors. Not because we wish to shut the world out, but because we believe every nation must choose the threshold through which opportunity enters. We welcome friendship, we welcome respect, but we will never welcome control disguised as generosity. To those who come with genuine partnership, our doors will always be open. But to those who believe they can decide our future for us, I say this: you cannot open what you did not build. Let the world remember, sovereignty is not a gift handed down. It is a right we uphold, a shield we forge with our own hands, and a legacy we protect for the generations yet to come.